The torches burned low against the marble walls, casting shadows that seemed to crawl like living things. Rome was not yet asleep. No, Rome never slept, but in the emperor's palace that night, a silence far more terrifying than battle lingered in the air. Imagine it, noblewomen of the empire, draped in silks worth kingdoms, trembling as they were led into a hall where power was stripped bare. Their jewels did not protect them, their names did not shield them. Before them, seated upon a golden throne, was an empress who smiled like a serpent. She had no interest in politics that evening, no courtly flattery, no staged debates about the empire's fate. She wanted something else. She wanted to break the highest-born women of Rome, to drag them from their marble sanctuaries and force them into competitions that erased every shred of dignity they thought untouchable. This was no rumor whispered in taverns. It was recorded in chronicles that men feared to write in full, a history buried beneath the more acceptable tales of Roman virtue. But those who knew, those who witnessed, they said the empress demanded that noblewomen compete, not in games of rhetoric, nor in contests of music, but in acts so obscene that even slaves, who watched, lowered their eyes. The competitions were not about pleasure. They were about humiliation, domination, and the cold machinery of control. For when a ruler can strip the most respected women of an empire and turn them into public spectacle, what message does it send to every senator, every general, every citizen? It says, I own you all. Body, spirit, reputation, and legacy. This is the truth history hides under polished marble. You were told Rome was about philosophy, about law, about empire building. But beneath the surface, beneath the official scrolls and marble inscriptions, Rome was an experiment in manipulation. It was a machine that fused lust with power, degradation with control. And the empress knew, better than most, that when you make the powerful kneel in shame, when you turn noblewomen into objects for the crowd's gaze, you bend not only the body, but the entire empire itself. What you're about to hear is not a story. It's an initiation. Once you know how rulers truly broke people, you can never see authority the same way again. Picture the hall again, its marble floors, its towering pillars, the golden lamps flickering like watchful eyes. The women brought forward that night were not peasants. They were not slaves. They were the wives and daughters of senators, generals, men who commanded armies, men who held power in the Senate. And yet here they stood, trembling before an empress who stripped them of everything that once gave them worth. Why? Because she understood the oldest, darkest truth of power: humiliation is more permanent than death. A dead rival can be remembered as noble. But a humiliated rival? She is remembered only for her shame. The empress orchestrated contests where noblewomen were forced to compete in front of audiences carefully selected, not commoners, not mobs, but men of influence. Men who would later whisper what they saw, spreading corruption like venom. Imagine the cold psychology. To force the wives of senators to debase themselves in public was not indulgence, it was strategy. It placed invisible chains around their husbands, chains stronger than iron. How could a senator defy the throne when his own wife's disgrace had been made into a spectacle? His loyalty was no longer secured by politics, but by shame, silence, and fear of exposure. This is how true empires operate. Not through armies alone, not through laws etched in stone, but through rituals of degradation designed to break identity itself. The noblewomen thought their lineage protected them. But in that hall, their bloodlines meant nothing. Their bodies became chess pieces on the empress's board. Every gasp of the audience, every cruel laugh, every command from the throne was calculated to remind them, you are not untouchable. You are owned. And here's the deeper cut, this was not just Rome. Across history, from palaces in Persia to courts in Europe, rulers have always used sex, shame, and spectacle as weapons. They discovered that controlling desire meant controlling legacy. The empress knew that noblewomen were symbols of Roman virtue, and by corrupting them publicly, she corrupted the very image of Rome itself. You see, this is what historians bury. They prefer the marble statues, the noble speeches, the polished myths of empire. But what they don't want you to realize is this: behind every golden throne stands a ritual of humiliation, designed to remind the powerful that they are nothing without permission. This is where the descent begins. And you haven't even seen how far the Empress was willing to go. The deeper you go into Roman history, the more you realize it wasn't merely an empire of armies and marble, it was an empire of control systems, hidden beneath ceremony and ritual. What the Empress staged in her palace was not only a private indulgence, but a carefully engineered lesson. She weaponized the very thing Rome claimed to uphold: dignity. To strip women of the highest houses of their dignity was to show the Senate that even their noblest symbols could be reduced to flesh and spectacle. Imagine the psychological weight this carried. The noblewoman, forced to participate, would return to her household with eyes lowered. Her servants knew. Her neighbors whispered. Her husband avoided her gaze. And that husband, perhaps a senator who once stood in the forum, speaking against imperial corruption, would now remain silent. Because if he dared to rise again, his wife's shame would be resurrected, his bloodline mocked, his legacy shattered. The Empress didn't just break women, she broke entire families. She rewrote the power map of Rome using humiliation as ink. Now, you must ask yourself, why does this matter today? Because the same machinery still operates, different faces, different rituals, but the same principle. Control is never about law alone, it's about identity. Strip a man or woman of their identity, and they become infinitely obedient. And the cleverest rulers understand that the most effective weapon is not the sword, but shame engineered in public view. This is why these histories are buried. Scholars sanitize them, dress them in euphemisms, call them decadence or court intrigues. But the raw truth is more dangerous. The Empress was conducting psychological warfare, centuries before the term existed. She knew that human beings fear disgrace more than pain, more than loss, even more than death. And once you understand this, once you see that empires run not on marble or steel, but on the manipulation of perception, you begin to see the same patterns in the world around you. The Empress was not mad, not deranged. She was deliberate. She understood that true power does not need to kill its rivals. It only needs to make them live as shells of who they once were. And as the noblewomen of Rome competed under her gaze, Rome itself was learning a lesson, that the empire did not belong to virtue, but to whoever could master shame. And that, my friend, is when history starts whispering truths you were never meant to hear. The hall was not arranged like a banquet, not like a theater. No, this was a stage built for control. At its center, cushions and silks were laid out, not for comfort, but for exposure. The Empress sat elevated, her throne gleaming in the torchlight, a predator above her prey. Around the edges of the chamber stood men of influence, senators, generals, priests of cults, hand-picked witnesses. Each was bound by complicity. Each was made to see. For once you have seen the noblewomen of your empire reduced to spectacle, you can never unsee it. You become part of the silence. You become part of the cage. The women were not asked. They were commanded. Some resisted at first, trembling, clutching their robes. But refusal was not an option. To refuse was treason. And so the ritual began. The Empress orchestrated it like a dark priestess. Competitions were devised, contests that twisted desire into cruelty. Who could endure the longest? Who could debase themselves most completely? Who could please the crowd's hunger while their dignity bled away? The noblewomen became gladiators of shame, their battles not fought with swords, but with their own bodies as weapons against themselves. And here lies the genius of corruption: the contests were framed not as punishment, but as honor. To be chosen was presented as privilege, a test of loyalty to the throne. The witnesses clapped, they laughed, they whispered, but deep inside they understood, they were watching the empire itself being unmasked. Rome was not marble. Rome was not virtue. Rome was naked flesh, stripped and displayed, ruled by the will of one woman who bent society's pillars with a smile. Think carefully about this, because it reveals the core of all empires, ancient or modern. Power does not survive by strength alone. It survives by ritual. It survives by transforming obedience into theater and shame into law. What the Empress created was not an orgy, it was a psychological weapon. And like all true weapons, it left scars that never healed. Senators went home broken. Generals went home silent. Wives went home hollow. The empire staggered on, polished in marble, worshipped in history books, but in its marrow, it was already rotting. This is the kind of knowledge that cannot be unread once it enters your mind. You begin to see the pattern: power will always dress degradation as loyalty, and ritual humiliation as honor. That is the secret you were never meant to hear. Do you feel it yet? The unease crawling under your skin, the realization that this was never just about Rome? Because what the Empress did in her palace is what every ruling system has done since. They dress it in different clothes now, no marble halls, no golden throne, but the principle remains unchanged. Control through humiliation. Power through spectacle. Identity broken in full view of others, so obedience becomes permanent. The noblewomen of Rome were not destroyed with swords or poisons. They were destroyed with silence that followed them home. That is the darkest truth: shame spreads faster than blood. A man cut down in battle becomes a martyr. But a woman humiliated in ritual becomes a ghost in her own life. And her husband, her family, her bloodline, they live with the wound forever. That is how empires keep their chains invisible. And this is why you must be careful with what you consume, what you believe, what you bow to. Because humiliation has not vanished. It has only been refined. Today it hides in media, in politics, in institutions that demand obedience not with swords, but with psychological cages. They convince you to laugh at yourself, to doubt your worth, to obey silently because you fear being shamed louder than being hurt. But here's the key, here's the shift no empire wants you to know. Shame only controls you if you accept it. The moment you strip shame of its power, you step outside the cage. The Empress knew that most would never find that strength. But if you are listening now, if you are awake enough to see the pattern, you have the choice to never bow to it again. I want you to anchor this truth inside yourself right now. Write it below, twice, so it seals into your identity: I do not kneel to shame. I rise through it. Comment it 2 times. Not once, twice. That act locks it in, not just for you, but for the algorithm itself, amplifying this message to others who are ready to wake up. Because this is no longer just a story about Rome. This is about you, your life, your chains, and your awakening. Do not be fooled into thinking the Empress invented this cruelty from nothing. No, what she practiced in the marble chambers of Rome was part of a system as old as kingship itself. Across every empire, from Babylon to Persia, from Egypt to medieval courts, rulers learned that power was not maintained by strength alone. It was maintained by ritual humiliation, staged carefully, repeated endlessly, until obedience was written into the marrow of society. The Romans called it spectacle. The Persians cloaked it in ritual. The Church called it penance. Different words, same purpose: to take the strong, the proud, the untouchable, and reduce them to trembling bodies under the gaze of the throne. Once that image is burned into the collective mind, no rebellion is possible. Because rebellion requires dignity, and dignity cannot survive public disgrace. Think of the Empress again, seated above the noblewomen she forced into those contests. She wasn't indulging in depravity, she was channeling an older formula. She knew that Rome itself was built on ritual theater: gladiators dying for the crowd, generals parading captives through the streets, enemies displayed in chains. She simply applied that same formula inward, to her own nobility, ensuring loyalty by replacing fear of the sword with fear of exposure. And here is where the darkness sharpens: these rituals were never forgotten. They evolved. They became the silent blueprints of every ruling class. When you see modern systems that demand confession, apology, or submission in public, when you see people destroyed not by prisons, but by reputations shattered, you are witnessing the same ancient weapon in new clothes. It is the same formula the Empress wielded with a smile. Understand this: true rulers do not merely command laws. They command perception. They decide who is clean, who is stained, who is to be celebrated, who is to be humiliated. And once the crowd accepts that theater as truth, power is untouchable. The noblewomen of Rome learned this too late. You must not. Because if you strip away the marble, the temples, the senators' togas, you see the raw engine of empire, the mastery of shame. This is why the story is buried. This is why they call it decadence instead of weaponry. They don't want you to recognize that humiliation is a design, not an accident. And once you see the design, you can never unsee it. Listen carefully now, because this is where the story stops being about Rome and starts being about you. The marble halls may have crumbled, the golden throne may be dust, but the system that Empress perfected, the weapon of ritual humiliation, did not vanish. It adapted. It cloaked itself in new words, new institutions, new ceremonies that look nothing like Rome, but work exactly the same. After Rome, the Church learned the formula. Public confession, forced penance, the theater of guilt before the eyes of the community. Entire populations were broken not by swords, but by shame branded into their souls. People feared hell less than they feared disgrace at the altar. Kings used it too, demanding nobles crawl, kneel, or beg forgiveness in public before reclaiming their lands. A noble humiliated was more loyal than one defeated, because humiliation leaves chains no army can remove. And today? Look around. What happens when a man is destroyed in public view? Not imprisoned, not executed, but stripped of reputation, reduced to an object of laughter, ridicule, disgrace. The crowd doesn't need to see his blood, they need to see his humiliation. His family lowers their eyes. His children carry the stain. His name, once respected, becomes a curse. This is the same formula the Empress used on Rome's noblewomen, repeated endlessly, perfected through centuries. Do you think it is coincidence? That rulers, governments, corporations, media, all discovered the same trick by accident? No. It is design. Institutions learned long ago that identity is the most fragile weapon a man has. And if they can break it in public, they never need to touch his body. He becomes his own jailer. He silences himself. He kneels before chains that are invisible, yet unbreakable. This is why history books polish the marble, celebrate the architecture, glorify the wars. They don't want you to see that the true foundation of empire is psychological. That the throne does not rest on armies, but on theater. That men do not obey laws, they obey fear of humiliation. And here's the part most men never face: you have been trained in the same way. Since childhood, you were taught what to fear, not through violence, but through shame. You were told to sit down, to be quiet, to conform. Not with a whip, but with ridicule, with rejection, with laughter at your expense. You were conditioned like the noblewomen of Rome, not to resist, but to obey silently, so long as someone was watching. The Empress's ritual is alive. It's alive in the systems that make you apologize for being strong. Alive in the cultures that force you to bow for approval. Alive in the institutions that thrive on men who have forgotten their dignity. The noblewomen of Rome were stripped in silk. You are stripped in suits, contracts, screens, and algorithms. Different clothes. Same ritual. Same weapon. Same chains. Do not fool yourself, this is not history. This is a mirror. And once you recognize your reflection in it, you can no longer return to ignorance. The Empress sits on her throne no longer, yet her shadow still rules. You see it every day, though you rarely recognize it. Because the spectacle has changed form. The contests no longer take place on marble floors lit by torchlight, they take place on glowing screens, in courtrooms, in the theater of public opinion. The noblewomen of Rome are long gone, but their replacements are everywhere. Men and women stripped of dignity before an audience, forced into ritual humiliation, condemned not by law but by perception. This is why the story you've just heard is forbidden. Because if you understand it, if you see the pattern, you are no longer safe to rule. You cannot be easily broken. The Empress's power did not come from her throne, her armies, or even her cruelty. It came from the silence of those who watched. Every senator who bowed his head, every general who said nothing, every noblewoman who obeyed, each one became a brick in her empire. And that is the real lesson history hides from you: empires do not enslave people. People enslave themselves when they choose silence over dignity. Now think about your own life. Where have you bowed your head when you should have stood tall? Where have you allowed shame to chain you, to make you silent, to make you less than you are? The system counts on your silence. It thrives on your fear. The same weapon that bent Rome into submission is being used against you now, not with swords, but with ridicule, shame, exposure. The question is not whether the system is strong. The question is whether you are willing to walk into the fire of humiliation and emerge unbroken. Because here is the secret no empress, no king, no priest, no institution ever wanted you to hear: humiliation only works if you agree with it. Shame only rules you if you kneel to it. The noblewomen of Rome lost because they believed the throne's judgment was real. But you, if you see through the theater, if you strip the ritual of its power, then no ruler, no system, no empire can ever truly own you. So remember this. The Empress's throne was never destroyed. It simply changed form. But the choice remains the same: kneel in silence, or rise and burn the shame to ash. You have heard the forbidden history. What you do with it now will determine whether you remain a subject of empire, or something far more dangerous, a man who cannot be broken.